Hi, my name is Mark Silver, and I'm presenting a series of videos for parents who have children with borderline personality disorder. And when we speak of children, we mean adolescents, young adults, or perhaps even older. I want to speak today about something that is ubiquitous with parents with children with these issues, and that is guilt. Guilt and self-blame. And it's important for parents obviously to take responsibility for their children and to provide for their needs, love, care, and support, including basic necessities. Um, at the same time, if you're a decent parent and you're a loving parent and you're doing your best, it's important not to blame yourself. It's important not to feel that you are the cause of your child's emotional dysregulation, that you are to be blamed for your child's behavioral dysregulation, and the host of other issues that we've outlined in other videos that comprise the criteria of someone with borderline personality disorder, both in the DSM-5 and criteria that I noted outside of the DSM-5 that I think are crucial to understand BPD functioning. When the parent is at a point where the self-blame is so intense, clearly the parent should seek their own therapist, and perhaps maybe they should have had a therapist of their own all along, so that the parent is able to discuss these issues, and hopefully, if the therapist is a good therapist, to have someone objectively, a healthcare provider, reinforce that you are not to blame. It's particularly important, not just for you, for your own psychological and emotional health, but it's important that the borderline child doesn't repeatedly pick up on this, because if that child does pick up on this continually, the child will run with the blame that the parent is inflicting on himself or herself and may use in a manipulative or coercive manner that self-blame, and the child may say, "Oh, you are to blame. You are the cause of all my problems." One of the core features of BPD is that the borderline has a particular difficulty assuming ownership for their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and especially for their own dysfunction and inability to progress academically, socially, emotionally, developmentally, and so on. Well, if you have BPD and you're an adolescent, who do you blame? You can blame genetics, and there's clearly a important genetic component. There could be chromosomal abnormalities, and indeed, chromosomal abnormalities are responsible for a wide range of developmental issues, including learning developmental issues and intellectual disabilities. But, for the child or growing adolescent or young adult, it's a bit amorphous, and it's not really possible to pin with any specific biomarker something that could be blamed for their issue, like you have a biomarker, genetic biomarker, for example, for many medical diseases. So when the borderline wants to blame someone, he's going to find a target that already assumes a sense of personal responsibility for wrongdoing. And when the parent continually assumes responsibility through self-blame, "Oh, I'm a terrible parent, I did wrong," especially when the parent says these things out loud, then the borderline child's going to pick up on it and think, that sounds right. That seems to make sense to me. You are a terrible parent. There's something that you've done, or a pattern of parenting towards me and maybe towards my siblings, that accounts for my dysfunction. It helps me to explain the chaos in my world. And it further negates the borderline from assuming responsibility for his thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. One of the places this is extremely prominent is with Alcoholics Anonymous. Um, there's a lot of good that Alcohol Anonymous does, and that model in general, which is used for other addictions. But one of the core features in the Alcoholic Anonymous model is that there is blame. And it's not with the alcoholic, it's often targeted toward the parent. That there was something about the parent's either negligence as a responsibility, as a responsible parent, or outright abuse as a parent that triggered or substantially directed the individual to become an alcoholic. This blame model is directed towards parents. This blame model assumes, in a very reductionistic way, and sometimes a simplistic way, that the parent is to blame. Now, there's a caveat here, and that is there are some terrible parents. And I see some individuals from cultures, for example, where child abandonment is ubiquitous. I don't want to name them because there's a lot of subtleties that need to be included here, but I see individuals in my work in forensics where not the majority, not the large majority, but the vast majority of clients I see have come from families where their fathers have abandoned them. They failed to provide proper physical, emotional, financial support, and so on. The mom may or may not be responsible. She may abandon the child as well, so the child is raised by grandparents. Often the mother is physically, emotionally, financially overwhelmed. The mom, with all these burdens, may end up in one or two or three very unhealthy relationships with short-term or long-term boyfriends or husbands who don't provide the proper care for the child. So all sorts of issues come out, and without the father there, it destroys the healthy scaffolding that the child needs to develop. That's an example where there is real blame, where the parent has not properly assumed responsibility and the child is harmed substantially as a result. Interestingly, what I see in these cases are not kids that grow up to be borderlines. What I see in these cases is kids that grow up with a deep sense of neediness. I see kids that are very dependent. I see kids that are very isolated. And I don't see them growing up to be borderlines. What I see is that they end up in adult relationships with partners who are abusive, physically, emotionally, verbally, sexually, financially, and so on. And these abusive partners set a pattern so that the child grows up not only in a single abusive relationship, but multiple abusive relationships, sometimes over a period of several years or even decades. Still, clearly, there are neglectful and abusive parents and environments is huge, that can either add to or trigger or substantially help us understand and inform the unhealthy development of an individual who may later be diagnosed or present with borderline personality disorder. There are many models of blame for parents, and I won't mention them, but there's one person in particular who's has a lot of, he's written a lot of books, he's on the internet, and what he suggests is that the real trauma that a child suffers is not the trauma of a particular trauma, but it's the trauma of isolation which occurs after. And I'll give you an example. So if a child is perhaps physically or sexually abused, that in itself can be traumatic. Don't misunderstand me. But what this individual suggests is that what is really the real trauma, that is traumatic, but the real trauma is that after the harm occurs, the individual feels isolated, shame, and the individual feels that he or she cannot speak openly in an honest manner about what has happened, so that it destroys the individual's authenticity, and they're not able to grow and develop with a true sense of self because of the shame and the harm that occurred. These are clearly models, again, where there is blame towards someone in the environment to at least some extent, and that needs to be considered. But overall, most parents provide reasonable love, care, and support for their child. Overall, most parents try to understand as best as possible difficulties that their child endure, particularly if the child has a developmental or psychiatric mental health or learning issue that needs to be addressed. And the parents may read up on it, talk to specialists, talk to the child's school system, pediatricians, and so on. It's so important that the parent does not blame himself or herself, because the borderline child will pick up on it, and it can become pathological in the sense that the relationship between parent and child and parent can be really jeopardized. One of the great things about AA, and I have this in my book and previous videos in the other series, is that when you're in AA, there are a couple of huge advantages. One is that you have a sponsor. And a sponsor is someone you can call up at any day or any time and say, I slipped, I had a drink. You may have been sober for one day, you may have been sober for 1 week or 3 years. And the sponsor will respond with open-ended, non-critical support, encouraging the alcoholic that, this is a bump in the road and you can get back onto the road to sobriety through better decision making and stop drinking immediately. And in fact, the person who's drinking can go to the AA meeting the next day and claim sobriety. There's so many kinds of positive supports that a borderline who's drinking, for example, can get. But it's a baffling disorder, BPD. It can be counterintuitive, contradictory, and difficult to discern the chaotic world that the individual is suffering. But for alcoholics, finding a sponsor is, it's relatively easy because AA meetings seemingly are everywhere. And recovering alcoholics understand alcoholism as a chronic and incurable disease. So finding a BPD sponsor is very, very challenging because it really doesn't exist in the same way, but the benefits can be enormous. And it'll take a lot of blame away from the parents who are terribly worried about the child. One of the things that I wrote about in the book is that something very interesting about AA is that in AA, sobriety is not achieved. It's declared. In other words, usually when you have a problem, a medical problem, psychiatric problems, you have to achieve health. You achieve it by taking the right medication, by going through to the right therapist, by getting proper sleep and diet, by doing the right things, engaging in healthy activities, putting aside unhealthy behaviors, and so on. In AA, sobriety is not achieved by doing things. It's achieved by a verbal declaration. And there's something very positive about that. There's something very positive about being able to say, today I'm sober. I am not drinking today. And even though it's perhaps been only, 5 hours or 1 day since my last drink, the fact is I'm not drinking now. And for people with BPD who live in a very chaotic internal world, there's something positive about that model where they can state, today I am healthy. Today I am healthy. It's a very positive thing. And in AA, we understand that tomorrow the person may be drinking again. And similarly with borderlines, we understand tomorrow may be a disaster. But today, for whatever reason, is not a disaster. Today is healthy and you're doing things that are constructive and you feel good. the last thing I want to say about parental self-blame is that um, it can be very pathological. In other words, if the parents truly blame themselves, assuming full responsibility for the child's harm, then everyone comes to believe it. And if you're so terrible as a parent, well, how can you ever fix things and help the child? If you're so terrible as a parent, and you just don't have those normal skills that some other parents will have, how can you ever act in a way that's going to be beneficial to you or the other family members? In other words, it's not only self-blame I'm concerned about and, driving yourself crazy and having that sense of responsibility that is not yours, but that it's going to affect the entire family system. This is the reality. Borderline personality disorder, like other disorders, will continue not for months, but for years or even decades. And it's important not to blame yourself. It's important to remain strong. It's important to look at this matter not just subjectively, but objectively, because many years or even decades after your child is out of the home and functioning in his own home, in work, or with friends or whatever, and your child still presents with borderline personality disorder, I think you could agree that you can't continue to take responsibility. And what kind of relationship will you have with your child in his 20s and 30s and 40s? You want it to grow and develop in a safe and healthy way. You want to be able to recapture the trust that was not there perhaps in earlier years, to reclaim the love and communication that was perhaps not available when your child was acting in a very dysfunctional way as an adolescent. And that can only happen if you love yourself as a parent as much as you love your child. Because if you continue to blame yourself, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. And with self-fulfilling prophecies of doom, there's very, very little opportunity for reclamation of improving relationships and communication and trust between and among individuals.